Rabina asked me to speak to the whole Yeshiva regarding the situation of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael these days. We have a short half an hour, and I'd like to address it by splitting the discussion into two parts. The two parts of Torah, Shtei Luchot, Luach Echad, Ben Adam Lechavero, Luach Echad, Ben Adam Lamakom. Let's start. HaKlal she'aTorah natna lanu, the klal that the Torah gave us, appears at least two places in Shas, as to how to relate to changing circumstances in our lives, is Hakol bidei shamayim, chutz mi'irat shamayim, which means everything that may happen to me as an individual or to Klal Yisrael is bidei shamayim. Bidei shamayim means, shamayim is that which is out of my reach, that which I cannot affect, that which is beyond me. Hakol bidei shamayim, all the changing circumstances in my life, as an individual, or as Klal Yisrael, is bidei shamayim. I'm not responsible for their situations that come forth. How I respond, ech ani megiv, how do I respond to the changing circumstances, that is already a measure of my yirat shamayim, and that's my free choice. But the changing circumstances are not my responsibility. That the Kadosh Baruch Hu sends my way. How I respond, that already measures my level. And predominantly, more than anything else, my level of my Yirat Shamayim, which measures more than anything else what a Jew is. The extent of his Yirat Shamayim. Let's start with Ben Adam Lechavero. Chazal teach us, En simcha kehatarat asfekot. There's no greater happiness, joy to a person other than resolving uncertainty and doubt. Now, if we take that statement of Chazal and we turn it as a coin onto the other side, that means there's no greater pain than being in uncertainty. Now, why is it relevant? Because many wives right now, as we're speaking, the past few days and in the next few days are going to go into an intense level of uncertainty as to what's going to be with their husbands. Because if Tzahal does go in, and not only fly from above and shoot from far, but does go in, we know who goes in, we don't always know who comes out. Chalila. Hashem Yishmo. And that uncertainty, Chazal say then, is the most painful aspect of life in Olam Hazeh, which is the world of doubt, Olam Shel Safek. Thousands and thousands of families, and mainly in the southern part of Eretz Yisrael today, are living in constant uncertainty, moment to moment, literally, as to when and where will the next missile fall. That's almost unbearable uncertainty. You can't live life without, you're constantly under the tension and suspense. When's the next one? And it's constantly coming down. This is the situation. How do I respond? How does Torah expect me to respond? We'll try to do this piece very short. When you check the origins of the process of Yetziat Mitzrayim in Parashat Shmot, we're not yet there in terms of the Parashiyot. We remember from previous years. It's just as relevant. Our Torah is eternal. The first very event in the adult life of Moshe Rabbeinu, he goes out, I'll read it inside. Moshe Rabbeinu could easily remain in the palace where he grew up, but instead, knowing that he's Jewish, he chooses to do something else. Vayibah yamim hahem, vayigdal Moshe, vayeyitzeh el echav, he goes out to his brothers, vayar b'sivlotam, to see their pain. Immediately following that, he sees, vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri mechav, he saw an Egyptian hitting a Jew, and he intervenes, and he kills the Egyptian. But he has to escape Egypt, so immediately we find ourselves already in Egypt, out of Egypt, where Moshe Rabbeinu is sitting by a spring, by a well, and his future wife, he doesn't yet know, and her sisters are there trying to draw water, but the men, the shepherds, are causing them trouble, and he intervenes. He could have easily said, as they say here in Israel, that's nothing to do with me. It has everything in the world to do with me, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu, in 3 episodes, one after the other, if you ask, who is Moshe Rabbeinu? With what merit does he become the leader of Klal Yisrael of all times? He is a person who cares about the pain of others. The midah, which is one of the midot through which we acquire Torah, and that is midat noseh be'ol im chavero. Perek Kinyan Torah at the end of Pirkei Avot, Perek Shishi. It's a braita of Kinyan Torah that's added to the 5 Parakim of Pirkei Avot. One of the 48 ways of acquiring Torah, in a way that if a person does not acquire this midah, he cannot acquire Torah, is bearing in the pain and identifying with the pain of others. Now, what is the way to do that? We see explicitly, the pasuk says, I'll read it again. I think this is the key. The need to step outside of my little daladamot, of my little egocentric bubble that I'm living in, and to consider the welfare of others. Now, mentally, that's not the easiest thing to do, but it's definitely possible. And I think that in terms of avodat ben adam lechavero, more than anything else, that's the chiyuv, that's the responsibility, that's the obligation that Torah expects from us at this stage. Now, the truth of the matter is, anybody who Chalila does not go into that mental place of putting a lot of mental effort to identify with the pain of others, that even if I'm not in the immediacy, in the proximity of where it's actually happening, to whatever extent I feel so that it's not so relevant to me, the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit, I don't remember if Daf Yud Aleph or so, the Gemara is extremely harsh. I don't want to quote. Kedai, get a chance, open up the Gemara in Ta'anit. What happens when Klal Yisrael is in a state of pain or are going through tzarot, and any individual says, "Ze lo nogea elai, it's not so close to me, it's not relevant to me." Kedai to see the Gemara inside. It's relevant to all of us. I'm speaking to myself more than to anybody else. I hope that's clear. It's very easy to get wrapped up in my little bubble. The changing of the affairs, how do they affect my little plans and my little plans for this year, for next year, or my only family situation? Or am I able to think outside the box of just myself? I always say this, and I'll say this again. We have a zchut, and he's not here, so I don't have to be makpid of not saying only miktzat shivcho b'fanav, or Rosh Yeshiva is not here. And I've been with him 25 years, actually more. And I've seen the person grow and expand beyond himself more and more and more as the years, as I know him. He used to worry about the program of his Chutz La'aretz Talmidim, and by today, and this is already a phenomenon that's been happening, I think, for 10 years at least, he thinks more and more Klal Yisrael, and he's concerned about what happens in Klal Yisrael, and that's the way a Jew is supposed to live his life. Slowly, he expands and expands and expands the boundaries of himself, to take more and more of God's world into consideration. Ultimately, to take HaKadosh Baruch Hu into consideration, because it's God's world. What I mainly would like to focus though this evening, and I'm shifting now to the other luach, Ben Adam Makom, is what is the way that a Yehudi Ma'amin, to whatever extent I'm a Yehudi Ma'amin, what is the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects me to relate, to understand, to respond to a situation of Klal Yisrael as we are at this point? Let's check the first time that we ever in the Torah needed to address a problem of Am Yisrael. When is the first time that the Torah had to address a problem in Am Yisrael? In the very inception of Am Yisrael. What's the very inception of Am Yisrael? Brit Ben Betarim. Avram Avinu speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, everything you're promising me is great, but I don't have children. Where are we going to move on from here? How is it going to work? That's the first problem in the history of Klal Yisrael. Could Klal Yisrael come into existence? And how does Hashem respond? Hashem says like this. And Hashem takes him outside. What does it mean he takes him outside? Rashi brings down a few different explanations. The theme there is as such. And that is, to the extent, Abraham, that you remain in your calculations in this world, in the closed box of this world of Olam Hazeh, I'm telling you, you're not going to have children. But if you're going to be able to step outside, similar to what we saw before, also, Ben Adam L'Chavaro, it's about stepping outside, but now it's stepping outside in a different way. Not of your bubble in terms of your personal interest, but stepping out of the bubble of this world. If your mind will be able to be elastic enough, and stretch and flexible itself to think outside of the box of this world, of Olam Hazeh, from that place you will have children. Now the truth of the matter is, when you think about it, the entire existence of the Jewish people, all throughout history, from then till today, stands on that stepping out. Because as crazy as an idea as the coming into the world of Yitzchak was from a biological perspective, as no less crazy is the existence of the Jewish people all throughout the ages. Maybe not biologically, but historically and statistically, our existence today doesn't make any sense. And it didn't make any sense 500 years ago, and it didn't make any sense 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago. We don't make sense. You cannot give any logical explanation for the ongoing existence of the Jewish people throughout the ages. I'll always quote now again, the great words of Rav Yaakov Emden, who was one of the leaders of Klal Yisrael around 250 years ago, who writes in his introduction to his famous Siddur, Bet Yaakov, that had I been standing at Kriyat Yam Suf itself, it would not have been a bigger testimony to the truth of the world and to Mitziut Hashem and to the truth of Klal Yisrael. It wouldn't be. It would be very intense. But you know what's more intense? The fact that I can stand now, and my point in history, he says 250 years ago, and I see the ongoing existence of the Jewish people throughout the ages, despite every attempt to demolish them from the face of the earth. Jews are able to sit every Pesach night and scream out, every generation somebody has the agenda to erase us from the face of the earth. Today they're not even embarrassed to say that. Straight out, every Monday and Thursday, the guy from the East stands up and says, our agenda is clear, to erase the Jews from the face of the earth. Throw the Zionists into the sea. Whether it's him or whether it's representatives from the north, from the south. Clear cut, he's not even embarrassed. And what will be his end? His end will be exactly the end of he who said similar words 70 years ago. And those who said those words 500 years ago, and 2,000 years ago, and 3,000 years ago, they will turn, and he will turn into the dust of history. That's the words of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And he said that without seeing Yerushalayim physically rebuilt, without all these many yeshivot that we're one of many, again here in Eretz Yisrael. He did not see the land of Israel become again the largest center of the Jewish people ever since Churban Bayit Sheni, as it recently became a few years ago. This is the way Torah sets the stage for eternity, for generations. You want to address issues that have to do with the condition of Klal Yisrael? Step outside of the box. In the box, it's not going to make sense. And same also over here, addressing the situation at hand. As long as we will be stuck in the closed box of headlines in newspapers, and the way it's presented in the media, and the way CNN is telling us what's going on, we're not going to be looking at the world the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at the world. We're looking at the world the way some Goy looks at the world, or some Israeli who's a good Jew, but he doesn't know how to look at the world because never he didn't grow up with a proper perspective, with putting on a new pair of glasses, the glasses of eternity. That's the way a Jew is supposed to look at the world, through Mishkafayim Shel Netzach, glasses of eternity. The strings of this war do not begin in the office of Mr. Obama. And with all respect, they don't begin even in the office of Mr. Netanyahu. They begin in one office, and that's the office that's addressed at the beginning of Masechet Avodah Zarah. When at the end of days, the Gemara describes the different nations are going to come into the office of HaKadosh Baruch Hu asking Sachar for what they contributed for the end of days. The Persians will come in, the Romans will come in, they will come in, these will come in. And they'll say we built all these marketplaces and all technology and wars and we did it all so that the Jewish people at the end of days could sit and learn Torah. Hashem says, you think you can fool me? The marketplaces was for your own selfish needs. And the bridges you claim to build was also for your own stuff. And wars, milchamot, the Gemara says, don't take credit for the wars. Wars belong to me. Milchamot ani asiti, says the Gemara. Shene'emar, Hashem ish milchama. We say it every morning. Hashem ish milchama in Shirat Hayam. I am responsible for wars, not anybody else. What does that mean that Hashem is responsible for wars? Hashem turns the wheels of history through many ways, but also one of the main means is through wars. That's the way history continues and progresses. Can you imagine the world before the Second World War, after the Second World, it's a different world. Without going into discussion to the better, to the worse, it's a different world. Always after wars, the world is a different place. Wars belong to me, God says, because history belongs to me. History doesn't belong to any historians. History belongs to me. I invented it, as I invented this whole world. Nature belongs to me. History belongs to me. It doesn't belong to anybody else. Many of us, and I think even many of us firm people, have a tendency, and it's natural, but our job is to think in a non-natural level. They did so-and-so to us, they shot so many missiles out, we'll get them back here. Who's going to win this stage, this battle? This stage in the battle will come to another end. Most probably. I'm going to have to daven to Hashem with our whole heart. With as little as pain to any Jew, anywhere in Eretz Yisrael or anywhere in the world. But this stage will come to an end. And then what? And where do we go? How do we address situations like this? Pirkei Avot teaches us. Everything we're supposed to always ask, Me'ayin bata ule'an ata holech? What is your origins? Where do you come from? Where does he come from, Yishmael? Where do Bnei Yishmael pop into history all of a sudden? Claiming for Palestinian people? Mapitam Palestinian people. There was no such people in the 19th century. How do they pop into history all of a sudden? Often people ask this question. What do you mean, Palestinian people, Palestinian state? You didn't exist. So if the Palestinian really is in touch with reality, his answer should be as such. Where do I come from? I'll tell you where I come from. I come from Sefer Bereshit. Sefer Bereshit? Yes, Sefer Bereshit, because Sefer Bereshit is the book of Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim, which means, by definition, anything that will ever happen in the history of the Jewish people or of the world throughout the ages always is going to have its origins back in the book that defines the prototypes of history, the book of Genesis. And if it did not have its origins there, it won't come into the world. That's the big rule that Nachmanides, the Ramban, gave us about Sefer Bereshit. Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim. That means, by definition, there's nothing that will ever happen that doesn't have its origin, its seeds, in Sefer Bereshit. Its genes in the book of Genesis. It's not an aspect of Sefer Bereshit. That's what Sefer Bereshit is. Sefer Bereshit defined Yishmael. Before he was even born, Vehu yeh pere Adam. Yado b'kol v'yad kol bo. The Torah defined him. Without going into questions of free will, where's his freedom, if he was defined as such in the womb, different discussion. He was defined as wild. First of all, he's wild. You hear the way he speaks, it's wild. You see the way he writes, it's wild. And the way you see, more so than anything else, the way he behaves is wild. We live from life. And Yishmael and his descendants live off death. They get excited when they see death. It gives them life. Nabach oivei, for a people who live from death. The mountain which is right in front of us is the explanation for all our wars with him. We know it's the most charged location on earth, even from a completely political point of view. But when a person of Torah, Ish Emunah, comes to look at the world, this is the center of it all. And when he builds his temple on the Temple Mount, it's not by a coincidence, and it's not random. It comes from somewhere. It comes from Sefer Bereshit. How is that? The Zohar teaches us the condition for having control over Eretz Yisrael is one. We read it a few weeks ago in Parshat Lech Lecha. Brit Milah. You stick to Brit Milah, you get the land. You don't stick to Brit Milah, Chalila v'chas. As we know from Parshat Aryeh, when our commitment to Brit Milah collapses. What happens to us and the land? The land vamis is Chalila out. Said the Zohar, there is another individual besides Avram and Yitzchak who goes through Brit Milah, and that is Yishmael. And in the merit of that, says the Zohar, he gets control over the land of Israel. Goes on the Zohar and says, though, that in the same way that his Brit Milah is empty, without going into the technical aspects of what's lacking there, says the Zohar, in the same way that it's empty, so too their control of Eretz Yisrael is empty. It's not so hard for us to understand what that means. When one understands what Kodesh HaKodashim represents, and when one realizes what they think is waiting for them in heaven after and as a result of sacrificing themselves for the sake of their God by killing innocent women and children and old men, not by mistake, to kill women and children and old men, so that I can fulfill my lowest of fantasies that I didn't get to fulfill here. Because here I portrayed myself modest. You see the way they dress, and they're women modest. That's outside. He's committed to Brit Milah, but in the inside, his true face comes out. Tell me your idea of heaven, and I'll tell you who you really are. And that's why he doesn't have really any true, eternal, essential relationship with this mountain. And that sight that we see every morning when we walk to Yeshiva, a golden dome above the Kotel, is the biggest sheker of the world, that he has any relationship with that place. And Avraham Avinu already told him that. Avraham Avinu said the most non-politically correct statement in Sefer Bereshit. You are similar, Ishmael, to the donkey. Sit here with the donkey. The donkey doesn't see what I see as he sees the mountain from far. Vayaret hamakom merchok on the way to the Akedah. You don't see. Stay here with the donkey. Not politically correct. And is it politically correct to shecht away children, old men? We're not anymore in one more stage of history. We're in a stage of history that never yet happened before, that the Jewish people, after thousands of years, come back to their homeland. As Chazal promised us will happen at the end of the exile of Edom, when we'll be controlled by the descendants of Esau, by the Western world, the Christian world. At the end of a very, very long, painful, and very dark journey of thousands of years, I'll gather you from the four corners of the earth and I'll bring you back to your homeland. These are psukim, these are gemarot, underlying theme in our entire Torah. And we got to see it with our very eyes. The process is still happening. But it's enough have happened already that anybody who opens his eyes a bit sees what a zchut it is to be in this generation. However, Chazal go on and teach us there's another slice. There's another stage that comes at the very end of Galut Edom. As the Jews come back to their homeland, there's going to be one more stage, and that stage is based on one pasuk in the Chumash. And that pasuk says as such. In Parashat Balak, when Bilam, in his last time that he opens up his mouth, prophesizes as to what's going to be the fate of different nations. He talks about Amalek, he talks about Edom, he talks about different nations. And then he talks about one more nation. But the pasuk is quite obscure, and it says like this. Vayisam Shelo vayomar, Oy! We all know what this means. Oy! Mi yichyeh misumo el. Oy! Who could live? Misumo el. Not so clear what this pasuk is saying. The Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin in Perek Chelek quotes this pasuk, and it says like this: Oy, for the nation that will be there at the end of days, when God will be busy redeeming His people. Oy, for that nation, because who dares puts a barrier between a lion and a lioness when they're about to connect and to mate? Kachal katuv b'Gemara. The Gemara doesn't teach us what nation that is. There will be a nation at the end of days when the Jewish people and God are going to try to come back from the exile and from their departure for thousands of years and to come back and re-embrace. There'll be a nation that will try to put a barrier and not let us do that. There will be that nation. Oy for that nation. What is that nation? The Gemara doesn't tell us. Midrash Pirkei de Rav Lezer does tell us. The Midrash says like this. I'm reading inside from Midrash Pirkei de Rav Lezer. Perek Lamed. Kedai to see this perek inside when you get a chance. We have it in the library, Pirkei Midrash, Pirkei de Rav Lezer. Amar Bil'am, משבעים לשונות שברא הקדוש ברוך הוא בעולמו, לא שם שמו לאחד מהם אלא לישראל. The only nation in the world that received God's name is Klal Yisrael. Shem Kel, part of the name Israel. However, הואיל וישווה הקדוש ברוך הוא שמו של ישמעאל לשמו של ישראל, אוי, מי יחיה בימיו? Because Hashem put his name also in Yishmael and not only in Israel, therefore, oi, who would be able to live in the days that he's going to take control of the land? Shene'emar, oi, mi yichyeh mismoel, which means, the Pirkei de Rav Lezer explains, oi, who could live in those days when we'll be affected by and conflicting with the people who also have the name Kel in, and that is Bnei Ishmael. And then Medrash goes on and says, Rabbi Ishmael, interesting of all people, Rabbi Ishmael omer 15 dvarim atidim Bnei Ishmael asot ba'aretz ba'acharit hayamim. 15 things are Bnei Ishmael future to do in the land of Israel at the end of days. And it goes and gives a long list. Kedai, as I said, to see it inside. We don't have the time to go into it right now. And Rabbi Ishmael ends up and says, Shalosh milchamot shel mehuma atidim Bnei Ishmael asot ba'aretz ba'acharit hayamim. 3 wars of chaos Bnei Ishmael are going to do in the land of Israel at the end of days. However, from those wars, ultimately will emerge, as it goes on and says, Tzemach ben David, Mashiach ben David will come out. The coming back to the land of Israel is not an easy comeback. It's a painful one on multiple different levels. Getting along from 4 corners of the earth, respecting each other coming from 4 corners of the earth, very challenging. On top of all that, having one more slice of galut for reasons that require a lot of contemplation. Why? There will be a nation there in the land that will give you a lot of trouble. Beware, I told you in advance. Different Talmidim came to me today. I'm sure also to others in the staff. Some Talmidim are afraid. People are living in uncertainty. What's going to be? How are things going to develop? A psychologist will address, and I'm not saying with any cynicism, a psychologist will address it the way a psychologist is supposed to address it, how to deal with fear in life. But la'niyut da'ati, there are other levels that a psychologist cannot and also is not allowed to address, at least not as a psychologist. Yadua Gemara b'sof Masechet Makot, we're about to wrap up. Rabbi Akiva and his friends are at Har Tzofim, Mount Scopus, and they're looking down at Makom HaMikdash, and they see foxes walking around Kodesh HaKodashim, and his friends start crying, and he starts laughing, and the whole interesting dialogue that takes place there. How can you laugh? How can you cry? They quote psukim of Churban, and we get to see Churban in front of our eyes, and we won't cry. Why are you laughing? He goes on and quotes, yeah, but you forgot the following psukim. The following psukim are talking about the future redemption, which will be the result of that whole process. How can you not laugh? The truth of that Gemara is, it's not that somebody's right or wrong over there. There's 2 different layers of how, depends on where you stand as how to look at the situation. One layer is there Rabbi Akiva's friends. Things are very painful. And if there are chas v'challah anybody's hurt, one is supposed to cry. But there's another layer. You don't have to be Rabbi Akiva only for that. People sometimes tell you, oh, if you be Rabbi Akiva teaches us. If it wasn't relevant, it won't be mentioned. It's there to teach us how to think. On top of everything, and on top of the situation itself, there's a whole other perspective that's hovering. And that perspective is the way Rabbi Akiva looks at the world. It's part of a plan, it's part of the historical plan, and we're just one more stage towards the end. Back in Rabbi Akiva's days, how much more so? Thousands of years later, where we're holding today. History does not belong to anybody else but HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And all that he does, and Midrashim say that, is for the benefit and for the good of the Jews. And that should put everything in a proper context. That's true. Sometimes when daddy is angry, daddy has to slap. And sometimes it's painful. But everything that he does is for the good. The more one internalizes these ideas, the more one reflects upon them. And it takes a mental effort of thinking about it. The more a person can come out of situations like this with might, with strength, that comes from clarity. Fear comes from uncertainty. Fear comes from confusion. I don't know what's going on. How can things happen? Who knows what's going to be? A Jew of proper emunah doesn't ask these questions. And it doesn't walk around the world trembling. History belongs to one. And also my own personal history, my own life story, belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All the changing circumstances and everything that will ever happen to me belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How I respond, that's up to me. That's all I have to be worried about. The more we connect to that, the more we internalize it, the less we have what to be afraid of. Hashem says to us, be with me and I'll be with you. Practically speaking, Kedai, Rav Amar spoke about it at the Kolta this afternoon, so that ideas don't remain floating in the air. Kedai, that every person does a little cheshbon nefesh and takes upon himself a certain Kabbalah for the sake of Klal Yisrael. Something small to take upon himself. It will be registered with you for eternity that you took upon yourself something that you never will stop doing. It doesn't have to be big, but it registered in you. It had a mark on you. It changed you. Because the things that happen in the world happen to change us. How do we know that? What set the stage for our entire history is when we were born at Kriyat Yamsuf, and we'll finish with this. All of a sudden, Klal Yisrael finds themselves on the water on the one side, and the Egyptian army dashing after them on the other side, and there's nowhere to go. And they say, we're just about to die. And they scream out to Hashem. And he responds basically and says, I orchestrated this whole situation. Nobody else did. Nothing was random. I orchestrated it to force you into a place to realize there's no other place to run away to life than the source of life itself, and that's me. You realize that? Baruch Hashem. The Egyptians go drown in the water. That's the whole point. The whole point is for you to realize everything I orchestrate in the world is just to bring you to certain realizations. Realize that. That will be the end of the problem. That's what the Ikvat and the Mashiach situation, all the difficulties that Chazal perceived for us, prophesied for us as to what the difficulties of the end of days will be, they're all there in order to bring us to the consciousness that we have nobody else to trust. It's not that Gemara and Masechet Sota at the end that says it's going to be very difficult. Oh, who can we trust? Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not who we can trust, only HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the situation is so bad. The situation was orchestrated for that purpose exactly, to realize that you cannot trust anybody but Him. That's the whole point. And the day that we chab that, and try to help others chab that, that itself is the solution to the problems. B'ezrat Hashem should get each one in his own way, in his own level of maturity, because it takes a lot of maturity to grow and to develop ourselves and others, to take upon ourselves certain Kabbalah, to come out of these days strengthened, with clarity, no confusion. I'm not lost, with no uncertainty. I'm clear-headed. A person who thinks clearly is a person whose life is strong, and his personality becomes stronger and more full of integrity. That's a proper Jew. That's the way our forefathers taught us to live, and that's the way we're supposed to live. B'ezrat Hashem, these words should be a zchut for Klal Yisrael, and any Kabbalah that anybody here takes upon himself should be a zchut for our chayalim and for our ezrachim. Everybody should be saved from any pegara. Hinei lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Thank you.